Thank you very much for joining in to this session. I think many people these days are worrying about where the information age will bring our society, and in particular how free people will be in the future. And in fact, there are some reasons for concerns, because according to Moore's law, there is this exponential growth in processing power. And every 18 months, basically, the processing power of computer doubles. And that means that in about 10-15 years, computers will have the capacity of a human brain. And one day they will be more capable than a human brain. And that's going to change society and the economy dramatically. We don't have much time to prepare. And the question is, how is our society going to change? The storage capacity for data is, by the way, growing even faster than that. So we're getting into a situation where the information and the processing cannot all be, the stored information cannot all be processed anymore. So how to characterize the age of information? First of all, besides brain-powered computer, we will have big data. Also, we are more and more facing cyber social systems where basically the real and virtual worlds are growing together. It cannot be separated anymore so easily. We need Google to orient ourselves. We need GPS to find our way in a new city and all this. And we're communicating through virtual systems. Then another point is cyber connectivity. So in some sense one could say there's too much data, too much speed, and too much complexity in the future. What to do with that kind of situation? I mean, given all the data that are now becoming available about human activities, what could we do with it? Well, we can certainly use this as an opportunity to craft new scientific instruments. In the very same way as we have crafted telescopes and microscopes and X-rays to see things that we would otherwise not have discovered, things that are important also for our well-being, we could actually create instruments that allow us to get a better understanding of our society and economy, hopefully solve some of the very old problems that are plaguing humanity. Future ICT has come up with a number of concepts, and here is a core part of it. Basically, we have said we need to bring together data and models and people. And for the data part, we have proposed to build a planetary nervous system which would, in real time, gather data about the state of the world, the physical world, the environment, technological world, but also about society and the economy. And it would help us to sense and understand, to create awareness, to turn data into information. And that information could then be used actually for a living Earth simulator, which would run models in order to look at what-if scenarios, and in this way basically get an idea of the possible side effects of our decisions and actions, and inform us better about risks and opportunities. It would turn information into knowledge. And then finally, to turn knowledge into wisdom, it's really important to involve people in all sorts of ways. So for this reason, we have proposed to create a global participatory platform. Now actually, the idea of the planetary nervous system has been taken up recently, and I think it will happen soon. Some companies seem to be thinking about it. There's this beautiful book about the human face of big data. And the first chapter, actually the foreword, has the title Planetary Nervous System. So this is going to happen. This book has been sent to 10,000 decision makers all over the world, all the important people. So I assume that this wonderful future ICT idea is going forward. And so what is the planetary nervous system about? It would measure through the internet, but also the sensor networks that will be becoming available in the Internet of Things. It would measure, in particular, the social footprint, but also things that we cannot see, like social capital, for example, trust. But from our perspective, it's important to do this in a privacy-respecting way. Altogether, however, this is a very ambitious plan, so it's a CERN-like vision, one could say, to create a measurement instrument for techno-socio-economic environmental systems all over the world. But a system that would not be available just for one government or one institution or one company, but for everybody, in fact. How would it work? I mean, here is a beautiful illustration how in a participatory way it's possible to get an idea of what is going on in other parts of the world. I hope this movie is going to play. So what happens here is that people have downloaded flickr photographs, millions of them actually, as they're freely available on the internet, some of them in a Creative Commons fashion, and then they're basically putting those photographs together. This is giving you an idea of where people have been standing and where their cameras have been pointing. So that's a lot of pictures, and after about 1 day of processing, you get into the situation that you can reconstruct, in this case, the Colosseum in 3D without ever being there. So you can do that from your desk in principle. You can basically take the world into your living room in this way. And you can do that with every place that people visit and take a lot of photographs from. Now you can go a step further and say, okay, in principle, we are all carrying a lot of sensors around with us in our smartphones. And those sensors can actually be used to establish something like a planetary nervous system. The main point is that this is happening with an informed consent, and this data is not being misused, but it's controlled by the user, and that would be a really big difference to how things are happening today. There are huge potentials, so that would allow to create new compasses for decision makers. Rather than just measuring GDP per capita, it would be possible to take into account health, environment, social well-being, happiness, whatever. And this could be measured really in real time and with a very good resolution in space, and quite cheaply, using information that actually people are living in the internet and elsewhere all the time. Now, one important point is, however, how to design the architecture of such a system. So it would not be misused all the time, but it would promote responsible use. And the question is how to do that. Here are a few ideas. So one problem, of course, is big data. That requires a particular data management. I think it's important that one would not just collect all the data one can get, and one wouldn't store them in one place. One would instead do a tailored measurement. I mean, if I want to know what is the temperature in New York at this time, what is the traffic situation in a certain street of Shanghai, in a certain point of time. What is the level of happiness in London now? That would trigger off a measurement process, basically, and sensitive information would be discarded, would be deleted already right away, would not be stored, but instead there would be an aggregation process that makes sure that sensitive information is basically diluted and it's not potentially misused. So aggregation on the fly, then one can of course do randomization of sensitive personal information, anonymization, encryption, digital rights management will also be important. And it's quite tricky how to set up such a system in the end, so it would work really to the benefit of the user. And then for the global participatory platform and Living Earth simulator, we want them to be used in a responsible way. And we believe that in order to reach this, transparency is important, accountability, self-regulation, such as an immune system. The interesting point about the immune system is it's fully decentralized, as compared to our nervous system, which of course is centralized and kind of directed, at least to a certain extent, by the brain. Of course, there are also other nervous processes which are not controlled by the directly. Then use crowd intelligence and reputation systems as kind of a social immune system. And then one idea is also to put the data into a sandbox, so you could not just simply download them to your own computer, but instead you would be able to send an algorithm to the data and run the algorithm on the data and would get back something which would inform you. So just suppose you were able today to send an algorithm to Google and find out something that is interesting to you. At the moment, Google is determining those algorithms that are run. Of course, then the next tricky question is, how do you avoid that, for example, people would try to find out sensitive information about individuals? So here I think privacy by design is important, that you could not just run and execute any possible algorithm, but only certain kinds of algorithms, for example those that do a data aggregation. That is also, of course, a tricky issue, and it requires a lot of scientific research how to set up such a system. It's a really big challenge, but very important for an age of information. So here again some points that we consider to be important, and people would have to work on those. Only then, I believe, can we afford to open up the potential of big data for everyone. We certainly don't want this as the perspective. Future ICT's vision was very different from that. We were not a European copy of what NSA had in mind, collecting all the data in the world. And in particular, we had in mind to open up the data, to make it transparent also what's being done with the data, and this way give control to the user, have something like a democratic control. So that is kind of the other way of approaching the age of information, and many people are concerned about it, and I think those concerns are quite justified. There are companies like Recorded Future, not just predicting the future, they're already recording what you will do in the future, of course with a certain probability, but they know it seems to be a collaboration between the CIA and Google, access the internet, they know your social network, your daily habits and all this, and from that point of view they can predict quite a bit of daily activities of individuals. So this is highly privacy invasive, and certainly that's not the idea of future ICT. Now, many scientists have contributed to big data algorithms, motivated by trying to make a contribution to a better world. And one of the arguments that has often been pushed forward is, well, we need to fight terrorism. And so many scientists have believed that and have created algorithms to identify, reconstruct social networks and kind of identify people who might be terrorists. It turns out, however, that the power of these approaches have been largely overestimated. Even the NSA had to find out about this problem. But there are even more serious problems, because assume that your algorithm is not 100% perfect, which is certainly a safe assumption. Assume that your algorithm would have a 1% error rate of false positives. Yeah? That means somebody who's not a terrorist would be identified as a potential terrorist. 1% is a very optimistic estimate. Now assume that you run your algorithm on 300 million people, or even a billion. You can easily see that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who are wrong suspects of terrorism. And that is the concerning part, that you might be such a wrong suspect. You might have difficulties to enter in other countries. You may be stopped by the police and bordered. Your bank account might be frozen, whatsoever, just because we believe too much into the power of these kind of algorithms. We've learned, for example, in medicine that mass screenings can create more damage through the side effects than the benefits it creates by identifying people who have a certain disease. And I think the same applies over here. We need to be very careful, actually, on what we're doing here, because the side effects could be more damaging than the benefits of this approach. So the message is, this cannot be applied to everybody. But it is currently applied to everybody. They go 3 steps in your social network, and if the friend of a friend of a friend, which you have never met in your life, is suspicious, you're suspicious as well, in some sense. So this is exactly the problem I was mentioning. There is no perfect algorithm. There are always false positives and false negatives. And that's why they will create unfair situations for a lot of people. In fact, 40,000 people have been stopped at British airports since 2001 as suspected terrorists and have been questioned. It's a very annoying procedure, and not even 1% of those people have anything to do with crime or terrorism. So it's highly invasive, I would say. And of course, it's likely to be many more people in the future. So we must make sure that we're not entering an age of discrimination by overestimating the power of big data. Besides, I think terrorism is not a very good argument, really, for demolishing privacy of people, because there is basically no terrorism. Apart from, of course, September 11, Well, you can see over here there were almost no attacks in the United States where people were dying. There were some attacks, but those might be attacks that were not even intended to threaten lives of people. The situation in Western Europe is not much different. Since 1998, there's almost no terrorist attacks. So, claiming that terror requires us to come up with large-scale surveillance of the people, I think, is out of range. It's not proportionate, one would say. It's not appropriate. There are many more people dying of smoking, of car accidents, and it's also worth noting that the additional number of self-suicides caused by the financial crisis has actually surpassed the number of victims of September 11. So there are really more important problems in the world. There are bigger threats to our society than terrorism. Instead, fighting terrorism seems to have increased terrorism in other parts of the world. So in the rest of the world, or the world altogether, we can see that terrorism is on the rise. But the question is, what is cause and what is effect? Is the war on terror maybe even producing more terrorism? That's a question that we need to ask, because if some people say we need to defend our freedom in the Hindu Kush, where would those people living in the Hindu Kush defend their freedom? So we really need to be careful about what we're doing, because we're talking about systemic effects here, and the complexity of the system could cause very different outcomes from what we want. So I believe those people who come up with surveillance may have the right intentions to protect the people, but they may still do the wrong thing because of the side effects that haven't been considered properly. Now, riots is something that politicians, of course, are also afraid about, and those riots in London were very shocking for the world. People haven't thought that we could have that within Europe, but it happened. And so one could perhaps argue that this is something that would be a reason for more concerns. But if you look into the situation in more detail, then you find that the riots primarily happened in those areas which are highly deprived. That means in areas where people really lack many things that make life worth living. And so a better way to fight social unrest would be actually investing into the living conditions of people, as it has been done in the past in some European countries. So that's something that would probably be much more effective, in particular given the huge sums of money spent on surveillance technology. These are many billions. They could probably be better invested into social well-being. Now, there is one other thing that is interesting to note, because one could argue, okay, why did it happen at a particular point in time, and we don't have riots all the time in those areas? Well, usually there is a trigger. And the trigger, this is what I've observed several times, is when people lose trust in the authorities. Here is an example actually from Zürich, where the migration offices had scandalous working conditions, were not working properly, and during those times the glass windows were damaged every 3 weeks. Then they replaced the boss of these migration offices, and since then everything is peaceful. People had lost trust in the authority, and there were good reasons for it. For the London riots, the trigger was that the police had shot a person, and they didn't come up with a good and convincing explanation to the public why this was justified. And so trust was undermined, and that's what basically triggered off the riots. So authority requires trust, and trust gives legitimacy. We should always consider this. Here is another interesting map which compares unemployment versus crime, and you can again see a high correlation in space. So this again suggests that social conditions are basically the important factors that determine whether crime happens. And so rather than putting cameras there, measuring unemployment would tell you where it happens. And I think our attention really needs to move to how to heal these kind of problems. These are complex systems, and trying to force a complex systems to do a certain thing often fails. We know that. Whoever knows complex systems theory knows that it will often fail. And we do see that those forcing strategies have often failed in the past, so we need to have a new approach actually of solving these problems. Another issue why you should be concerned is that there are certain people who decide what is right or wrong, and what is right today might be wrong tomorrow. We are currently having discussions about this in Germany. We had these discussions about smoking, for example. We may have such kind of discussions about eating meat in the future. Yeah? So the moral conditions, but also the laws might dramatically change. And while you feel safe today, being part of the great majority who thinks to do the right thing, you might turn out to be in a minority position tomorrow. In fact, all the important groups of our society are minorities. Billionaires, politicians, lawyers, intellectuals, artists, whatever. They're all minorities, and that means they're all vulnerable in principle, and we have seen it in history many times that these minorities can get into trouble if the political conditions change, and they're changing all the time. Besides, today we have so many regulations. If you would really record it, you would find out that almost everybody is violating some law almost every month. So there's one journalist in Germany who is trying to live according to law for 1 year. There are tens of thousands of laws actually, and they're often overlapping and contradictory, and that's creating an awkward situation. So all those technologies and data that we have today, and even those in the future even more, would actually allow to single out minorities who are doing things wrong. We could say, okay, what's wrong about giving a ticket to somebody who is speeding? Of course, you would always find a good reason. Wrong parking, terrible. Dropping your cigarettes in public, terrible. Dropping your chewing gum, terrible. Whatever, so you can get into a situation when you start to punish everything that we find a behavior that we don't appreciate or think it should be suppressed, but we could easily end up with a situation where our democracy gets demolished. It's very important, I think, to recognize that for the ability of a society to do the right thing, you have to allow certain wrong things to happen. Because in many situations, what we believe is wrong today may turn out to be right tomorrow. Our society has to adapt to environmental change, to technological change, to many things all the time. It can only do so by innovation, and innovation, almost by definition, is always challenging the status quo. So if we punish everything which doesn't correspond to how we do things today or how we want things to be done today, that would actually undermine our ability to adapt. Diversity is the driver of innovation. Now, there is another concerning point that most industrial countries have huge amounts of debts, and so the question of how to fill basically the budget of those countries, and as you have the ability to use big data to identify wrongdoers in all sorts of areas, you can basically say, okay, we're charging people for doing wrong things and they should be charged, but if that we reach a too high level of applying punishment strategies, I think it will really undermine democracy. There are some countries, including the US, where prisons are actually business opportunities, where they're privately owned, and sometimes even judges have shares of prisons. That is actually raising a number of serious questions. I read about this in the news, about 45 million arrests connected with the war on drugs. Of course, drugs are terrible, but it was not successful at all. So very recently the US decided that they would change their strategy because they had put too many people to prison for too little reason. That's what they finally concluded. Now the question is, what do you think are the freest countries of the world? And what are the most suppressive countries in the world? So what is the freest? France. Any other idea?
Norway.
Norway? What about the United States? You always learned it's the freest country in the world? No? Let's have a look at the number of prisoners in each country among 100,000 people. I was very surprised to see this list. The United States has the largest number of prisoners by far, more than Cuba, Russia, 10 times more than Switzerland and Germany. That's something to think about. And in terms of safety, actually, it turns out that countries like Switzerland and Germany, who don't put many people into prison, seem to be safer than the United States. So again, that points to social and economic conditions might be much more important than a powerful state which is controlling people. There's another thing that one might be concerned about, namely that there is quite a number of laws that are not complying with the institution. And so the institutional courts have a lot of work to do basically to make sure that the Constitution is respected. And that applies in particular, of course, to personal information. I think privacy is important. While some people have claimed that privacy is an outdated thing, I think a society cannot work without privacy, because privacy is basically the other side of the medal, which has publicity, or the public on one side and the private on the other side. So it's kind of, you define one thing by the other. You cannot eliminate privacy without eliminating the functionality of the public. This is very important to understand. I believe privacy is important for people to recover from the daily stress of adaptation. We have to adapt to thousands of norms every day, yeah, to make other people happy, even if we don't want to take care of what other people think of us, but we do, and it takes energy, and you have to recover somewhere. So it's a pressure relief system. It's a strategy that kind of decouples a system. Just suppose you would know about everything that your neighbor did. And of course, he would have other values than you. Then you would start to argue with your neighbor about what is the right way of having a personal life. We would struggle all the time if we knew about everybody's lives. So it's a conflict avoidance strategy. Our society, given the densities we have today, wouldn't work without privacy, which is a peacekeeping strategy. And there's so many more things. It's also the basic of trust. So I knew, for example, that I could keep my diary on the shelf and my parents wouldn't read it. That was kind of a defining element of my relationship to my parents, that I could trust them. And as I said, trust is the basis of legitimacy and authority. So I come back to this. So if we feel observed all the time, we will start to self-censor our thinking and our ideas, and that will undermine our ability to innovate. In fact, The Economist has even pointed out some time ago that we are in an innovation crisis, and I think there is a good reason for it. Innovation requires diversity, innovation requires an ecosystem, requires different people, different ideas, different values, to complement each other, to interact with each other. So if we would all be normal, like average of our society, we would just be homogeneous, there would not be no diversity, our society would not work well. No, it would be a society on the level of North Korea. The social benefits of our society are only possible, and also the economic well-being is only possible through this huge diversity and complexity. So don't wish it was not there. So the question is how to do it differently from the control approach. I think we can handle complexity and also security issues in a decentralized way. I feel much more confident about it. The immune system is working in this way, and it's very effective actually. There's also something like a social immune system, like trust and reputation, social norms, and so on. And it's interesting that Obama's Consumer Data Privacy Bill of Law starts with one very elementary word, which is trust. Trust is essential to maintaining the social and economic benefits that network technologies have bring to the United States and the rest of the world. Trust is at the center. You cannot have a stable society without trust. and trust is certainly something different from general surveillance. How would we build trust and reputation? Well, in fact, we see already the spreading of reputation technologies all over the web, and that must have a reason. It's an evolutionary process that is going on, which I think is building a new kind of social and economic system. And these reputation systems turn out to be good for everybody, for buyers and sellers. Sellers can sell their products at a higher price if they have a good reputation. Buyers feel more comfortable about the deal, and they will often get a better service. So it's good to introduce these feedback loops in our society. It promotes responsible behavior. It allows a company to sell products with a more quality, socially responsible production, environmentally responsible production that you wouldn't see by just looking at the price tag. But a reputation system can inform you about all those things. However, most of today's reputation systems are basically controlled by a company or institution, and that creates something like a filter bubble. I mean, what Google sends to you and other social networks is tailored to what the system thinks is your interest, your taste, or whatever. And so you don't see those things anymore, which contradict to your taste, your values, your personality, and that creates actually a situation that makes it difficult to communicate with people who have other values. We are seeing that in American politics, where Republicans and Democrats basically can't talk to each other anymore. They're using different words to talk about the same things, like health reform or whatever. So it's falling apart, and if those recommender systems are not designed in a pluralistic way, it can seriously undermine the wisdom of crowds, which is actually the basis of democratic systems and also of financial markets. So we should not try to manipulate people's decisions, because that can undermine the wisdom of crowds. And how to change those reputation systems such that they would be pluralistic? Open up the rating data to the users. Allow them to define the filters that would finally recommend them this or that or that. So they could consider sources of information they find trustworthy, single out other sources of information they don't trust, share their own reputation filters socially with others, your friends, your colleagues. They could modify them. And so eventually that would create an ecosystem of filters which would evolve over time and come up with better and better filters, so we would be able to use the huge amounts of information on the web in a better and better way, so we could really unleash the benefits of information in the information society of the 21st century. Thank you very much.